think it's safe to say that Lewis Hamilton's first race for Ferrari didn't go well. Not exactly a Luca Badoa kind of disaster, but for Lewis Hamilton, it was shockingly underwhelming. As a result, he's failed to emulate the likes of Mansell, Alonso, Raikkonen by winning on debut, and I'm pretty sure that Ferrari's got a lot of questions to answer because of it. Because you have to look back a very long while past Luca Badoa's 17th place debut, where he got lapped considerably, to find a similarly awkward debut for the Scuderia that came with a lot of hype attached to it. That being, of course, Jean Alesi back in 1991 after stunning the world with Tyrrell the previous year. He was classified in 12th position. But before any of you F1 historians type in the comments to tell me how wrong I am aware that that was down to a gearbox problem. Hamilton's 10th place finish, which was classified, that was not great, and people are debating whether or not it was a disaster on historical levels. This one stings the most considering, well, who Lewis Hamilton is. He's a 7-time world champion going to Ferrari, unlike Michael Schumacher, who became a 7-time world champion with Ferrari. I'm trying to be fair with Lewis here and really acknowledge the fact that this is a huge change of culture from Mercedes to Ferrari, but the fact is though, he is the most successful driver in Formula 1 history. The bar is really high at a team which also has expectations which are sky high. It's so high, it's gone past the Earth's atmosphere, it's looped around the solar system and come right back again. Because that singular point of Lewis's for the Australian Grand Prix, that is not the fairy tale start that he hoped for. Even when you consider that his teammate Charles Leclerc had his own fair share of troubles to deal with in the other Ferrari, as well as him losing further spots due to a spin. And in a way, Lewis should be relieved that he had a spin Charles, because if he hadn't done and he would have finished maybe 6th or even 5th, then that would have made Lewis's lot all the more worse and the scrutiny would have been even bigger. However, you cannot solely put the blame at Lewis Hamilton's door. Ferrari do have a lot of things to answer for, because as many people have pointed out in various corners of the internet, the Ferrari strategic efforts strike again. After 2 decades with Mercedes, adapting to the Ferrari car, especially in the wet, was going to be a challenge, and to make matters worse, Ferrari's hesitant strategy calls, that cost him valuable positions of his own. So for any Lewis Hamilton fans out there, well, this comes with the territory of racing in red. Moreover, communications with his race engineer Riccardo Adami, they were far from ideal. Hamilton felt overwhelmed by a barrage of instructions that didn't match the evolving track conditions, leading to further loss of pace and control. And despite his talent and preparation, Hamilton couldn't extract the car's full potential, settling for 9th place. That is until a certain angry Australian had something to say about that. That move around the outside and the dying embers of the Australian Grand Prix, Lewis couldn't even settle for the fact he was going to finish behind Leclerc. He had to settle for 10th, and that would have made things even worse. Yeah, that move of Oscar's on Lewis, yikes. Yeah, that capped off a frustrating race for the 7-time champion, and really highlighted the steep learning curve that he is going to face in adapting to Ferrari's setup, strategic approach, and culture. It'll leave him with significant room for improvement in the races to come though. And to make matters all the more imperative for driver and team, we are going into another race week with the Chinese Grand Prix. And even though history does favour Lewis Hamilton, with him having won the Chinese Grand Prix a total of 6 times, the most of any driver in the history of Formula 1, that will either make things a little bit more hopeful for the driver, or it's going to make things all the more intense because, well, he might be one of the favourites to win it, especially if it does remain dry, which is predicted to be the case. A podium finish in China would be the perfect way to bounce back, but this is just the beginning of his Ferrari journey. It's not a make or break moment, but he does need to have more make moments than break moments before we can then say whether or not the move to Ferrari was or make or break manoeuvre of his career. Whether this was going to be a brilliant final chapter, or it was just going to be like the last few episodes of How I Met Your Mother in how disappointing it was. Yes, Ferrari had a lot to answer for in their typical strategic manner, but there were instances on the track which did make me sweat a little bit. The fact that Alex Albon was managing to defend against Lewis Hamilton in a Ferrari, which should have been faster than the Williams, and continuing to do so for multiple laps. Oh, okay. And all that Ferrari are doing right now is embarrassing themselves and their megastar signing. Because that combination wasn't as electrifying as predicted or hoped. Because Ferrari's debut support for Hamilton, it could have been more tailored given how intensely scrutinised his first race was going to be, and how much money and prestige is attached to it. In such a high-pressure situation, Switching teams, adapting to a new car, and even more hands-on approach from Ferrari might have helped him settle in faster. However, you could easily argue that even the most storied and best Formula One teams out there have to deal with surprises coming their way. What with a regulation change, or maybe a freak weather condition that they weren't predicting or anticipating, such as the rain in Australia, because Ferrari are usually quite good around Melbourne. So maybe in Ferrari's defense, they can't always provide the best support possible, certainly on this occasion, which was all too evident. Yes, I can easily imagine that people who are critical of Lewis Hamilton, Ferrari, or both, are preparing themselves to be bestowed with more ammunition should Lewis Hamilton succumb to more issues at the Chinese Grand Prix, as well as Ferrari themselves. But there are many nuances to really take into consideration here, but Lewis also has a reputation of being able to bounce back at his lowest possible moments, rise to the occasion where it matters. It can be done historically. He has been around for a long time to provide you with plenty of historical examples. So even though Ferrari sort of botched his debut and gave him a really awkward beginning, and that's something he will not want to remember, his first race for Ferrari, that's going to be really sad in the future of his. But at the same time, it's not the be-all and end-all, but they do need to kick on. They cannot rest on their laurels, especially when we've got a race this weekend. There has to be something done fast. The work put into the integration of Lewis into the squad has clearly not been enough. If he had come home sixth or something like I predicted he might, that probably would have been acceptable given how strong the McLarens and the Mercedes were that weekend, as well as Max Verstappen. It must have been galling for Lewis Hamilton to witness the team that he had departed actually end up doing better than both he and Charles Leclerc, but that's not the point of this video. Although, admittedly, you also look to how Carlos Sainz did on his debut for Ferrari and him finishing 8th in Bahrain 2021. Again, I'm talking statistically, not subjectively. F1 does move fast. Hamilton needs to adapt just as quickly. Plenty of greats had tough Ferrari starts, but if he does learn fast, this will be looked back on as a mere hiccup, not a legacy-defining moment. His own words and Ferrari suggest better days might be ahead, because according to the race, Hamilton does admit that the Grand Prix was a crash course in adapting to a Ferrari with its unique setup, tricky rain conditions, and less than ideal strategy calls. But he also emphasised that he's learnt a lot from the experience. He has not ever defined one race, the first race of any particular stint of his career, as something that would go on to define his tenure with the team for the rest of his career. That is something to really remember here, but the key difference here is that this is Ferrari. Lewis is going into this as a megastar of the series, the biggest star that has ever been a star. So there are going to be expectations held here. And even though it is good to hear that he has not allowed this to completely buckle him into submission, there does need to be change had, and Ferrari really need to make good for the person that they've been able to convince to leave the storied relationship he had with Toto Wolff and actually show and provide him much better equipment and perspectives for that 8th World Championship. You would think, though, that all of the work that would have been undertaken from day one of his tenure with Ferrari to prepare himself for the Grand Prix, and even during pre-season testing, they would have come up with something that would have prevented a miscommunication drama with his race engineer. Surely during Bahrain testing, they would have simulated a race run, thrashing out a protocol between the pair, which would then yield the kind of information that would be wanted from the driver. Listening back to those radio exchanges, they were not ideal. And that moment when Lewis Hamilton accidentally forgot to press the button to turn the radio off, and he exclaimed an expletive, that was incredibly awkward. The relative silence after the race as well. There is a lot of work to be done here. But to be fair, Charles Leclerc also lamented the fact that there was information overload going on over the radio, he telling the pit wall to be a little bit more quiet. So it's not just Lewis here. This is a team issue that came at the worst possible moment. But there is every reason to hope that Lewis can come good, because he is a 7-time world champion, and he himself has silenced the critics who dare pin age as a factor that could limit him in his approach with the Scuderia and potential in the future. And well, considering that there's a 44-year-old rookie knocking around at the moment, fine, I won't factor that into the conversation. But even then, you've only got to look at the last 2 multiple world champions to arrive at Maranello and how they got on to realise that the adjustment period argument for Lewis is not quite as solid as he would hope, especially when you take the debut of Sebastian Vettel into account. When he arrived, he was in a similar situation to Lewis Hamilton, that he bled Vettel Red Bull. that he was the living embodiment of that team. He was the star of that squad. He put Red Bull on the main stage with his 4 consecutive world titles. He managed to, alongside everyone else who was working in Milton Keynes, establish that team as not just the party organisation who were there just for fun, they were there to win. And they won a lot. And this move of Sebastian's to go to Ferrari to emulate his mentor Michael Schumacher and win a world championship with them, this was not something he took lightly. This was a major deal for him. And the acclamation period as well, according to the German, was of course very tense. He also likened the first steps with Ferrari as a crash course in learning the nuances of a new team, its engine and car setup, because he was going from a Renault unit to a Ferrari one. Learning those finer points of the Ferrari power unit, they were very, very critical for his driving inputs. And despite early technical and communication hurdles, Vettel ultimately found the experience incredibly rewarding, with a podium on debut followed by a victory the following outing. And yes, we all know that he ultimately didn't succeed in getting that title with Ferrari to emulate Michael Schumacher. He certainly gave it a damn good go in 2017 and 18, and even though it really crumbled in 2020, he did bow out of that team with good grace. Because everybody, and myself included, would have understood if Sebastian decided to get a little bit bitter and salty toward the team, but he didn't. He remained really, really professional and gracious. That was something that really endeared him to everybody. It's why people still love him today. And as for Fernando Alonso, well, we know that the relationship between him and Ferrari broke down ultimately, but considering the awkward divorce from McLaren and his mainstay Renault team falling off before selling itself off, his Ferrari debut back in 2010 was even more impressive than the likes of Sebastian Vettel, because he too, as a multiple world champion, was talking about the change going from one power unit to another one, the Ferrari one, was a steep learning curve, having to adjust his feel of the entire operation and machine. That it had a unique balance, the way its power was delivered, the overall team culture, it required time and a lot of fine-tuning. But he also noted that once he overcame those early challenges, the potential of the car quickly became evident. He won on debut. He made an emphatic announcement that he had arrived at Ferrari and he was going to be within a shout of the World Championship, even though a win didn't come again until the German Grand Prix, when we then got the infamous "Fernando is faster than you" toward Felipe Massa. Oh, the whole team order debate. So even though Lewis Hamilton has butted heads against Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso on the road, there is a degree of support toward the British driver's plight. At the same time, though, their immediate success also taints that support in a way, but it's still something to acknowledge and also address to you. It does at least illustrate that Hamilton's struggles, they're not specific or unique. Even elite drivers can endure rough initial periods at Ferrari. It can lead to remarkable success once the learning curve is overcome. And although Hamilton's difficulties might feel more pronounced due to his immense reputation, hopefully indicate that his current struggles will be merely temporary. At the same time though, that same reputation will not sugarcoat the fact that this was not the dream start that he had hoped for many weeks and many months, ever since the deal was announced back in February of last year. There has been much hype, much speculation about what was going to happen at this team. Whether or not he would succeed, turn over a new leaf, flourish, fail, what have you. There have been plenty of takes to be had with this one, and this has not gone off to the best start, considering how much lead-in time there has been. The hype has become astronomical, and then the result was the 10th. Oh. This is something hopefully that can be addressed, and we know Ferrari can be Ferrari at times, but also Lewis has to be Lewis to try and make up the difference. Kind of like how Max Verstappen has to make up the difference at Red Bull sometimes. But as has become clear, in Formula 1 it truly is a team effort. Ferrari do need to step up to the plate to try and not tarnish Lewis's reputation, because he doesn't deserve that. To arrive at his dream team and then not provide the dream, but only complete nightmares. You could sense that Lewis was all too aware of this over the radio. He was doing his best not to fly off the handle with his engineer. He then left the comlinks open, he cussed the fact that he was in 9th place, whilst his old boss Toto was actively following along his position out of habit and wishing him well. And then, of course, Hamilton's replacement, he comes home in 4th ultimately. And it does make you wonder, had Kimi Antonelli not had that bib damage in Q1 or spun out in the Australian Grand Prix, and also there was another incident where Kimi almost spun on lap 1. He had this jackknife thing, but he managed to keep it together. That car control of that boy is intense. But again, we're not talking about Kimi or Mercedes in this video. But admittedly, it does make you wonder whether or not, had things actually gone Kimi's way, he might have actually been just saying, Ciao to Verstappen. Imagine that. Because I think Lewis would rather imagine that he was up there with Norris and Verstappen. So come on, Ferrari, what are you doing? But either way, the story isn't over yet. Hopefully the history books will judge Hamilton's Ferrari tenure not by this first race, but by how he responds. If he bounces back with a podium in China or a win in the next few rounds, this debut will be nothing but a footnote. Sure, it would be an awkward start, but if he does rise to the occasion and win the world title this year, then, the absolute rise to the top would be even more glorious. But if Ferrari's struggles continue and they don't get on top of the situation and the regulations, especially when the flexi wing rules change for the Spanish Grand Prix, and even then I'm hearing rumblings from the FIA that they're going to be even stricter at the Chinese Grand Prix, so we might get some changes of the regulations even sooner, then that's going to make Ferrari's plight all the more hard to bear for both them and the drivers. Ultimately, if Leclerc and Hamilton find it a real struggle to get near the podium or get a win or two, then this is going to be maybe seen as the first warning signs of the relationship between driver and team. But again, history does prove that Hamilton has the skills to turn things around. It's just, it all needs to come together. Because the lack of a solid or emphatic opening statement is a major stumbling block to accept, especially when you look at the best greats who debuted for Ferrari and see where they ended up. You've got, of course, the likes of Jose Gonzalez in 1951 getting Ferrari's first ever win in Formula 1 as an independent team, Giancarlo Baghetti, Mario Andretti, Nigel Mansell, Kimi Raikkonen, Fernando Alonso. All of those men, some of them are touched upon at the beginning of this video, got a win on their first ever race in red. And I could easily imagine that it would be a bitter pill to swallow for Lewis that he's not able to emulate those greats of the sport. But, to be fair, there are other examples of Ferrari drivers who did not win on debut, but did go on to great things, such as, of course, Michael Schumacher, there's John Surtees, who went on to win the 1964 World Championship with Ferrari, and then, of course, Jody Scheckter. So whilst this might be a silver lining to the otherwise cloudy skies that were Albert Park the other day, this is something that maybe Lewis can cling on to say, hey, hopefully one race will not define my entire career in red. But then at the same time, you then look at the other races that debuted for Ferrari, and even the ones that didn't go on to win world championships and mainly had reputations for being number 2 drivers, had better results upon their first race with the Scuderia. You got Eddie Irvine finishing 3rd at the Australian Grand Prix, Rubens Barrichello securing 2nd place, Felipe Massa not doing too badly on debut for Ferrari in 2006. It's all swings and roundabouts really, that it's really not ideal for a storied driver like Lewis to have such a underwhelming result considering how much hype there had been going into this, with Fred Vasseur deliberately establishing the announcement of Lewis Hamilton going to Ferrari early on purpose, nipping it in the bud before the 2024 season, when Ferrari ultimately would contest in the Constructors' Championship. Now though, things are looking a little more precarious because the changes that the team has made to that car have not borne fruit immediately in the way that they had hoped. The media is going to be looking at this race and many races to come to see whether or not it was worth it Lewis leaving Mercedes, and if he just stuck it out one season longer, then maybe it might have been worth it and we might have seen Lewis Hamilton on the podium in Australia. That part is hypothetical. It's not ideal, there are still more races to come, but it's still not the best start that anybody had hoped for or expected. However, there is a little bit of a saving grace here, because there is one name that I have not mentioned in regards to their particular debut, because that wasn't the best of debuts in of itself. Of course, Alain Prost. When he joined Ferrari in 1990, he quickly discovered that adapting to the Ferrari's way of doing things, that was no small task. The car he was given was markedly different from the cars that he'd mastered at Renault and McLaren, especially at a time where the team were looking for a new leader and to turn things around going into the new decade, to partner their other fairly big signing, Nigel Mansell from Williams. The car also demanded a type of driving style that was not really suitable to the likes of Alain Prost, and Prost has gone on the record many times saying that he had no choice but to adapt his otherwise smooth, elegant style, which went to be emulated by the likes of Jenson Button, who won the championship in 2009. It was a far cry from what Alan was used to. His debut race was met with a retirement. In fact, I think it was a double retirement for both he and Nigel. He did rise to the occasion ultimately, and by the time you get to the Japanese Grand Prix of 1990, he ends up, despite the crash with Ayrton on the first corner of lap 1, he was only 7 points behind, so it does go to prove that even though the first race turns out not to be what you might have expected when representing the Scuderia, it can turn things around. There is hope for Lewis. I am trying to be fair here, that there are examples for it being a disaster, and there are examples for it to be not so much of a disaster. But you could easily say, whichever way you look at it, it's certainly not ideal. There is still time for Lewis to pull off a similar rebounding maneuver, because again, if he can add a 7th victory at the Shanghai International Circuit, a lot of the noise will go away. Even if it's just a podium, it will certainly make Australia look out to be more of a blip rather than a foghorn, but the stakes are understandably astronomically high now. One of the most scrutinised Ferrari moves in modern F1, on par with the likes of Schumacher, Alonso and Vettel, other world champions. Because those men, they are pretty storied within the sport, but Lewis is bigger than all of them. And therefore, it's either going to be an even bigger euphoria if he comes good, or it's going to be an even bigger disaster if it doesn't come good. And even though I acknowledge that changing from one way of doing things that you're used to and have been for the better part of 25 years is going to be a very tricky situation, it's still something that happened. The preparation that he and Ferrari undertook, which we all thought was rather impressive and detailed, it ultimately failed. The dynamic between race engineer and driver did not bear fruit. The opposite of how it did bear fruit when Charles Leclerc changed his race engineer to the likes of Brian Bozzi last year, and then went on to have one of his best seasons, in fact, arguably, the best season of Formula 1 he had ever had. Now, I'm not wanting Lewis Hamilton to fail or anything like that. I genuinely, after all the stuff he's been through, the successes that he has had, to have that dream role with Ferrari, and recall those moments at Maranello with a smile, not with a grimace or anything like that. I don't want this to be akin to what Michael Schumacher had to deal with Mercedes, it ultimately not being the thing that he expected. A good, decent comeback. But again, that's for another video. But again, I'll leave it in the video up there. Or there. But the events of last weekend, they were incredibly worrisome, whichever way you look at it. Lewis adapting to the car, his engineer thrashing out a system of communication, the team's strategic calls, it was a complete mess. And the one person who stands to come out of this looking the worst is, of course, Lewis Hamilton. And I bet you he will not stand for that, nor will his fans. Which is something I do believe could become a problem. That if things become painfully contentious or close between his camp, if it does come good, when you've got Leclerc's own base to consider, then that might add to Ferrari's worries at a time where they do not need any more problems. To find out why this influential pair might jeopardize the continued development of Ferrari, whether or not it turns out to be not so good or stratospherically good, watch this video next, straight after this one.